Garrett Voss snatched the pot of stew right off the stove, in front of everyone, and dumped it into the dirt. "Nobody asked for your cooking," he said. "Nobody asked for you." The kitchen went dead quiet, 12 men staring at the floor. Not one of them said a word. Evelyn Hartwell stood there, ladle still in her hand, stew dripping off the edge of the pot onto her boots. She was 41 years old. She had buried a husband, lost a farm, and ridden 3 days on a rattling stagecoach to get to this ranch. She had exactly $4.30 left in the world. She did not cry. She did not apologize. She looked at Garrett Voss and said quietly, "I'll make another pot." If you've ever been dismissed by someone who decided what you were worth before you opened your mouth, stay with me. Because what Evelyn did next changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens in the next part of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach left Evelyn at the edge of a dirt road with no ceremony and no apology, just a cloud of dust and the fading sound of wheels rolling away. She stood there with her suitcase, a brown leather thing that had belonged to her mother, so worn at the corners the leather had gone soft as cloth, and looked out at what was supposed to be her next chapter. Raven Creek Ranch spread out ahead of her in the flat Kansas distance, a cluster of weathered buildings, a barn big enough to swallow a house, and cattle so far out on the plain they looked like dark specks against the pale grass. The sky above it all was enormous and colorless, the kind of sky that made a person feel very small and very alone at the same time. Evelyn had not come here because she wanted to. She had come because there was nowhere else left to go. The letter from the ranch, sent through a hiring agent in Wichita, had been brief: cook needed, room and board provided. References required. She had written back with 3 names: a schoolteacher in Dodge City who had eaten her meals for 6 months, a widow in Abilene whose household she had managed through a hard winter, and a pastor's wife who had written, unprompted, that Evelyn Hartwell was the most capable woman she had ever known in a kitchen or out of one. The job had been offered. Evelyn had accepted. She told herself it was just a job. She told herself that every time. The walk from the road to the ranch house took longer than it looked. By the time she reached the main yard, her right boot had rubbed a blister on her heel, and the suitcase handle had left a red line across her palm. She set the bag down in front of the main entrance and knocked. Nobody answered. She knocked again. Still nothing. From somewhere behind the barn, she could hear men's voices and the occasional crack of something heavy being moved. She picked up her bag and walked around. There were 6 of them in the yard behind the barn, loading fence posts into a flatbed wagon. None of them looked up when she arrived. She waited a reasonable amount of time, long enough that it became clear they had seen her and chosen not to acknowledge her. And then she said, "Excuse me, I'm looking for Mr. Callahan." One of the men, a lean fellow with a jaw like a shelf and dust caked around the creases of his neck, finally turned. He looked her up and down the way you'd look at a horse you weren't sure was worth the feed. "You the cook?" he said. "I am." He made a sound in his throat, not quite a laugh, not quite a dismissal, something in between, and jerked his chin toward the main house. "Kitchen's through the side door. Don't touch anything in the study. Mr. Callahan will find you when he's ready." He turned back to the fence posts. Evelyn picked up her suitcase and went. The kitchen was not what she had hoped for. It was large, that much could be said for it, with a good iron stove and a window that let in a fair amount of light. But the shelves were in chaos, with bags of flour shoved against tins of lard and dried beans spilling out of a sack that hadn't been tied properly. The floor had been swept recently, but not mopped, and there was a smell under everything, something sour and faintly wrong, like meat that had sat too long before it was cooked. She set her bag down by the door and stood in the middle of the room and breathed through her mouth for a moment. Then she tied her apron on and got to work. She spent the first hour just learning the space. What was where? What was missing? What had been allowed to go bad? She found a wheel of hard cheese with mold creeping across one side, a sack of onions where 3 had gone soft at the bottom, and a tin of baking powder that had been opened and left without a lid. She sorted. She organized. She made a mental list of what would need to be ordered and what she could salvage. By the time the men came in for the midday meal, she had a pot of bean soup on the stove, made with the salvageable onions, some dried sage she'd found in the back of a shelf, and a ham hock that was old but still good. and a pan of cornbread that she had mixed fast and thrown in the oven 20 minutes before she expected anyone to arrive. She had guessed wrong on the timing. They came in 15 minutes early, 8 men crowding through the side door, tracking mud without thinking about it, pulling off hats and dropping them wherever. They stopped when they saw her. "Where's the bread?" one of them said. "Not hello, not who are you, just where's the bread?" "In the oven," she said. 5 more minutes. "The last cook had bread on the table when we came in." "The last cook isn't here," Evelyn said, and turned back to the stove. There was a beat of silence, and then a few of the men shuffled to the table and sat down. A few more stayed near the door, watching her with the particular suspicion men reserve for things they didn't choose and can't control. She ladled soup. She cut the cornbread when it came out, not quite as golden as she wanted, but solid, with a good smell, and put it on the table. Nobody said thank you. A few of them nodded. One of the younger ones, maybe 17, with ears that stuck out and a look on his face like he was perpetually surprised to find himself wherever he was, said quietly, "This is better than last time," and then looked immediately embarrassed, as if he'd said something he shouldn't. That was when the side door opened again. He was taller than she expected, and broader across the shoulders, with dark hair that had started to go gray at the temples, and a face that had spent a lot of years in the sun. He moved through the kitchen the way a man moves through a space he owns completely, without looking at anything too carefully because he already knows what's there. He glanced at the table, at the men eating, and then at Evelyn, with an expression that was harder to read than she would have liked. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Callahan," she said. "Wyatt," he said, "we don't stand on ceremony here." He pulled out a chair and sat at the end of the table, and without another word, one of the men passed him a bowl and the cornbread, and he ate. Evelyn had interviewed for exactly 11 jobs in the 18 months since her husband Thomas had died. 6 of them she hadn't gotten. 4 of them she had left. One because the family wanted her to sleep in a storage room with no heat. One because the man of the house had ideas about what her duties included that had nothing to do with cooking. One because the woman of the house had paid her half of what she'd been promised. And one because the children had been genuinely feral in a way that wasn't funny. The 11th job here was the last name on her list. She watched Wyatt Callahan eat without speaking and tried to decide what kind of man he was. He cleaned his bowl. He didn't compliment the food or complain about it. He stood, pushed the chair back in, which none of the ranch hands had bothered to do, and said, "I'll show you your room after supper. If you have questions about ordering supplies, ask Garrett. He handles the accounts." "Who is Garrett?" she said. "My foreman." He paused at the door. "He'll find you." Garrett Voss found her that evening. She was washing the supper dishes when he came in. She heard the door but didn't turn around immediately because her hands were in hot water and she was working a stubborn pan. And by the time she turned, he was already standing closer than was comfortable, leaning against the counter with his arms folded and a look on his face that was not quite hostile but was also not anything like friendly. He was a big man, not in the way Wyatt was big. Wyatt was solid, the kind of solid that came from real work, but in a thicker way, with a heaviness around his jaw and through his midsection that suggested he had once worked hard and had since found ways around it. His eyes were a flat, pale blue, and they moved over the kitchen the way a landowner moves over a property, taking inventory. "You rearranged the shelves," he said. "I organized them," she said. "I could see where everything was before." "I can show you the new arrangement. It'll take about 30 seconds. His eyes settled on her then, and the look in them sharpened, just slightly, in a way she filed away without reacting to. "The supply order goes through me," he said. "You want something, you write it down and you give it to me. I decide what gets ordered and what doesn't. Understand?" "Of course," she said. "Good." He pushed off the counter. "Don't go looking at anything that isn't your business." He left without explaining what her business was or wasn't. She turned back to the dishes and stood there for a moment with her hands in the cooling water, thinking. She had worked in enough houses and on enough properties to recognize the feeling of a place where something was being protected. Not a secret, exactly. Secrets were specific. This was more like a territory. Garrett Voss had just walked into her kitchen to tell her, without saying it plainly, that there were borders around her and she would be wise not to cross them. That feeling, that particular tension in the air when a powerful man walks into a room and tells a woman what she may and may not concern herself with, was something Evelyn knew the way she knew the smell of rain coming. She had felt it before. She had ignored it before, and it had cost her. She finished the dishes. She went to her room, which was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a hook on the wall for her coat. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her boots, carefully, because the blister on her heel had gotten worse, and looked at the $4.30 on the nightstand. Then she took out the small leather journal she kept in the inside pocket of her coat and wrote down the 3 things she had noticed today that didn't fit. The supply shelf had been restocked recently, but the quantities were wrong for the number of men on the ranch. The flour was at least double what was needed. The sugar was low when it should have been adequate. And there was no ledger in the kitchen. Every ranch she had ever worked on kept a kitchen ledger, a running record of what was used, what was needed, what had been ordered. It was basic. It was how you kept from running out of things and from being cheated by suppliers. The absence of one wasn't impossible, but it was unusual. She wrote it down. Then she closed the journal and went to sleep. Over the next 3 days, she learned the rhythms of the ranch. The hands came in at 5:30 for breakfast, returned at noon, and ate again at 6. There were 14 men in total, though the number who appeared at any given meal varied. Some were out on longer rides, some were pulling fence work far from the main buildings. The work was hard and constant, the way ranch work always is, and it left most of the men too tired to be talkative. But they noticed the food. She could see it in the way the younger ones started arriving exactly on time instead of 5 minutes late, and in the way the older hands began scraping their bowls clean instead of leaving the last quarter out of habit. Nobody said much. Ranch hands rarely did. But a man who is eating well carries it in his posture, and by the 3rd day, she could see the shift. Wyatt Callahan said almost nothing to her directly during those 3 days. He ate with the men, he worked alongside them, and he moved through the main house in the evenings with the focused quiet of a man who had a great deal on his mind and had decided to carry it alone. Once, passing through the kitchen while she was rolling dough for the following morning, he paused and looked at the organized shelves for a long moment, and then looked at her, and she thought he was going to say something. Instead, he just nodded once and kept walking. The second time she spoke to Garrett Voss was on the 4th morning. She had needed to ask about a meat delivery that was supposed to have arrived 2 days earlier and hadn't. She found him at the desk in the small office off the main hallway. The door had been half open, and she knocked on the frame. And he was bent over a set of papers, writing quickly with his left hand, and he shut the papers under the ledger book when he heard her knock. The motion was fast, practiced. "The beef delivery," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "It was supposed to come Wednesday. I'm planning the week's meals, and I need to know if I should work around it." "It's been delayed," he said. "Order something else." "Do you know when it'll arrive?" "When it arrives," he said. She thanked him and left. In the hallway, she walked slowly and thought about the papers he had pushed out of sight. She had not been able to read them. She had only seen them for a second, and the angle was wrong. But she had seen enough to know they were not standard correspondence. The column format, the rows of numbers, those were accounting records of some kind. Why would the foreman be copying numbers out of the account ledger into a separate document with the door almost closed? She went back to the kitchen and wrote it down in her journal. By the end of the first week, she had a list that she kept folded inside the journal's back cover. 7 things that didn't add up. The flour order 2 weeks ago had been for 40 pounds, but based on the meals she'd been making and the record of how many men were eating, 30 would have been plenty. The salt pork she'd found in the cellar was marked with a supplier's stamp she didn't recognize, which meant it hadn't come from the regular Wichita supplier listed on the one invoice she'd managed to see. 3 of the ranch hands, men who had been here longer than the others, had stopped talking whenever she entered a room mid-conversation, which could mean nothing or could mean something. She wasn't ready to call it theft. She wasn't even ready to call it suspicious, not officially, not to anyone else. She was a cook. She had been here 8 days. She had no authority, no standing, and no reason that anyone would listen to her. But she kept writing things down. On the 9th day, she found the second ledger. She wasn't looking for it. She had gone to the storeroom off the kitchen to pull a jar of preserves from the high shelf, and when she dragged the step stool over and climbed up, she found that the jar had fallen behind a stack of old newspapers that were wedged between the shelf and the wall. She pulled the newspapers out to get to the jar, and behind them, lying flat against the wall, was a slim leather-bound book with no label on the cover. She should have left it. She knew even as she picked it up that she was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She opened it. The entries went back almost 3 years. Numbers, dates, names of suppliers, all written in a small, careful hand that was not the same as the handwriting in the kitchen receipts she had seen. The columns didn't match the ranch's stated purchases. Prices were listed that were significantly higher than the market rates she knew from her time in Wichita. And at the bottom of each month's page, a separate total was circled without any label at all. She stood on the step stool for 2 full minutes, turning pages carefully, reading. Then she put the book back exactly where she had found it, replaced the newspapers in front of it, retrieved her jar of preserves, and climbed down. Her hands, she noticed, were not quite steady on the way down. She gripped the edge of the step stool until they settled. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the stove and stirred a pot. She didn't need to stir, and thought. She had come to Raven Creek Ranch with nothing except the ability to cook well and the need to hold on to a job long enough to save a little money and find a next step. She had not come here looking for trouble. She had specifically, deliberately, come here to avoid it. But what she had just found in that storeroom was not a small thing. That ledger, if she had read it correctly, and she had added and subtracted and kept household accounts her entire adult life, so she was reasonably certain she had represented years of money being quietly moved from Wyatt Callahan's ranch into someone else's pocket. She stirred the pot. She had a choice. She could put the journal in her coat pocket, collect her wages at the end of the week, and find the next stagecoach out of Raven Creek before this became her problem. Or she could do something about it. The problem was that she had never been very good at walking away from things that were wrong. Thomas had told her that once, not as a criticism or not entirely as a criticism. Sitting at their kitchen table in the farmhouse outside Abilene, the night she had gone to the county clerk's office to challenge a water rights claim that was taking irrigation from 3 neighboring families who couldn't afford a lawyer. "You are going to get yourself into serious trouble one of these days," he had said, and then he had helped her organize the paperwork. She missed him with a fierceness that still caught her off guard sometimes. She took the pot off the heat. She was going to need more than what she'd found in the storeroom, and she was going to need to be very, very careful about how she went looking for it, because the man who had shut those papers out of sight when she knocked had eyes like a man who knew exactly what he was hiding, and he had already told her, in the way powerful men always told women like her, to stay in her place. She was going to need to make him think she had. She did not sleep well that night. She lay on the narrow bed in her small room and stared at the ceiling and went over the numbers again in her head, the way she always did when something was bothering her, not with panic, but with the steady, grinding attention of someone who has learned that panic wastes time. The circled totals at the bottom of each page in that hidden ledger had been consistent, not random. Not the kind of inconsistency that comes from sloppy bookkeeping or an honest mistake made under pressure. They were too regular for that, too clean. Someone had been doing this deliberately and carefully for a long time. She turned onto her side and looked at the wall. Outside, the Kansas wind was pushing against the building with that low, constant sound it made at night, like the land itself was breathing. She had grown up with that sound, back on her father's farm outside Salina, and it had never frightened her. But tonight it felt like it was pressing in. She thought about Thomas, not with the sharp grief that used to stop her mid-step in the early months after his death, but with the quieter ache that had settled in since then, the kind that lives in the chest and doesn't announce itself, just sits there and occasionally makes itself known. Thomas had been a practical man. He would have told her to write everything down, get it in order, and not say a word to anyone until she knew exactly what she was dealing with. She was already doing all of that. But he also would have told her that going up against a man like Garrett Voss, without knowing who was standing behind her, was the kind of thing that ended badly. She closed her eyes. In the morning, she got up an hour before the hands were due for breakfast and went back to the storeroom. She was not going to take the ledger. She wasn't even going to handle it more than necessary. What she needed was time, and she needed to not be caught. She pulled the newspapers away from the wall again, opened the slim book to the first page, and began reading with the focused speed of someone who has spent a lifetime making sense of numbers quickly. The earliest entries were from 3 years ago, almost exactly. The handwriting was consistent throughout, the same small, left-leaning script on every page, which told her one person had been keeping this record the whole time. The supplier names changed occasionally, but the pattern didn't. A purchase would be listed at one price in the official record, and in this hidden book, The same purchase appeared at a higher price, sometimes 10% more, sometimes 20, once, in a cattle purchase from nearly 2 years ago, nearly 40% over market rate. The difference, the gap between what was paid and what should have been paid, was what was being circled at the bottom of each month. She did the math in her head as fast as she could. Over 3 years, conservatively, the total came to somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000. Her hands were steady this time. She had moved past the shaking stage somewhere in the night. She replaced the book, replaced the newspapers, and was back at the stove with a skillet of salt pork sizzling before she heard the first boots on the steps outside. The morning passed the way mornings on a working ranch always did, fast and loud, and then suddenly quiet once the men went back out. She cleaned, she prepped for noon, she made her list of what needed to be ordered. And she thought. The problem with what she'd found was that she couldn't use it. Not yet. A hidden ledger found behind newspapers in a storeroom was evidence of something, but it was the foreman's word against hers about what it meant. And she was 9 days into a job on a ranch where nobody knew her, and nobody had any particular reason to trust her over a man who had been here for years. If she went to Wyatt Callahan today and said, "Your foreman has been stealing from you," he might believe her, or he might not. And if he didn't, she would be on the next stage out of Raven Creek with no reference and no money, and the knowledge that she had thrown away her last position on a gamble that didn't pay. She needed more than a hidden ledger. She needed to understand the whole shape of it, who was involved, how the money was actually moving, and whether anyone else on the ranch knew or suspected anything. She started with the ranch hands. Not with questions. She was smarter than that. She started with food. Over the following she began making small adjustments to the meals that had nothing to do with the budget and everything to do with paying attention. She started baking extra in the evenings. Nothing elaborate, just simple things. Dried apple turnovers one night, molasses cookies another. The kind of food that made men linger at the table a few minutes longer than they meant to. And while they lingered, she listened. Ranch hands talk. That's something people who haven't spent time around them don't always know. They're quiet when they're working and they're quiet when they're exhausted, but put a warm kitchen and something sweet in front of them after a hard day, and they become surprisingly human. They talked about the cattle, about the fencing that needed doing on the North Quarter, about a horse that had gone lame and whether it was worth the vet's fee. They complained about the weather, they argued about small things, and occasionally, if she was patient enough and still enough, they said something that mattered. The first thing that mattered came from a hand named Clem, who was maybe 50 and had been at Raven Creek longer than anyone except Garrett himself. He was sitting at the end of the table one evening, working through his second molasses cookie with the unhurried focus of a man who has learned to appreciate small pleasures, and he said to the man next to him without looking up, "You notice the east herd counts off again?" The other man, younger, kept his eyes on his coffee. "Don't notice things like that." Clem made a sound that wasn't agreement or disagreement and said nothing else. Evelyn, at the stove, stirred a pot she didn't need to stir and added east herd count to her mental list. 3 days later, she found a way to ask about it without asking directly. She was bringing a noon meal out to a group of 4 hands who were working fence on the far east side of the property. Wyatt had asked her to do this, with something close to apology in his voice, because the fence work was running long and the men needed to eat. And while she was laying out the food on the wagon's tailgate, she said casually, to no one in particular, "It's a big herd to keep track of out this way." One of the men, a quiet redhead named Ed, who hadn't said more than 10 words to her since she'd arrived, looked up and said, "Used to be bigger." She waited. "Lost a fair number last spring," he said. "Sickness took some, and some just—" He stopped, glanced at the others. One of them was looking at the ground. "Anyway," Ed said, and picked up his sandwich. The conversation ended there. But the way it ended, the glance, the pause, the way the other man had suddenly become very interested in the dirt, told her something. The loss of cattle last spring had not been entirely accounted for in a way that satisfied everyone who worked here. She drove the wagon back to the main house and added it to her journal. The journal had 22 entries now. She had started organizing them by category: supply discrepancies, herd records, accounting irregularities, behavioral observations. The behavioral observations were the ones she found herself returning to most often, because numbers could be explained away. But people were harder to argue with. Clem stopping mid-sentence. Ed's deliberate pause. The ranch hand, she still didn't know his name, who had looked at the floor when she mentioned Garrett Voss on her first day. The way Garrett himself moved through the ranch house, always knowing exactly where he was and who was near him. The way a man moves when he's gotten comfortable being the most dangerous person in any given room. She had known men like Garrett Voss before. Not this specific variety, the type that operated through financial manipulation rather than outright force. But the fundamental shape of him was familiar. He was a man who had decided early on that the rules were for other people, and who had found a place where he could exercise that belief quietly enough that nobody with the power to stop him had bothered to look closely. He wasn't cruel in the obvious way. He didn't lose his temper. He was controlled and watchful, and he had made himself indispensable to Wyatt Callahan in the way that people like him always did, by making themselves the only one who understood how all the moving pieces fit together, which meant that Wyatt, for all his competence and authority, was being managed. He just didn't know it. Evelyn thought about that a lot. She had not had many real conversations with Wyatt Callahan since her first day. He was not a man who talked casually. He would ask practical questions. Did she need anything from the supply run? Was the kitchen stove drawing properly? Had she met the 2 new hands who'd come on last Monday? And she would answer them, and he would nod and move on. He ate with the men most evenings, and occasionally she caught him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something that fell between assessment and curiosity. Once she had been in the main hallway when he came in from the yard, and he had stopped and looked at her and said, without preamble, "The men are eating better." She had said, "I'm glad." He had stood there a moment, like he was going to say something else, and then he hadn't, and that had been that. But she thought about the way he'd said it, not as a compliment exactly, or not only as a compliment, more like he was acknowledging something that surprised him. She was on her 16th day at the ranch when everything began to move faster. It started with the supply delivery. She had been told by Garrett that a shipment of goods was coming from a supplier in Wichita: flour, salt, coffee, a quantity of dried goods, and that it would arrive on Thursday. She had planned her week around it. Thursday came and went with no delivery. She mentioned it to Garrett on Friday morning. "Delayed," he said, not looking up from the papers on his desk. "By how long?" "I'll let you know." She went back to the kitchen. On Saturday morning, she heard a wagon in the yard. She looked out the window and saw a delivery man she didn't recognize unloading supplies, and the quantity looked wrong to her even from a distance. She dried her hands and went outside. "Morning," she said to the delivery man, who was a heavy-set fellow with a sunburned forehead and no particular interest in conversation. "I'm the cook. Can I check the order against the manifest?" He handed it over without argument. She looked at it. The quantities were what she had requested, but the prices listed were not the prices she knew from the Wichita suppliers she had worked with before. They were higher, not outrageously, not in a way that would be obvious to someone who wasn't paying close attention, but meaningfully higher. And at the bottom of the manifest, the supplier name was one she had seen in the hidden ledger. She handed the manifest back. "Thank you," she said, and went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a full minute. Then she went to the storeroom, took out the newspapers, opened the ledger, and checked. The supplier on this delivery, Hendricks & Sons, out of Wichita, appeared 3 times in the hidden record. Each time, the listed price in the hidden book was notably higher than the amount that should have appeared in the official accounts, with the difference circled neatly in the usual way. Garrett Voss was not just cooking the books. He was using specific suppliers. His suppliers, she now understood, people he had an arrangement with, to run inflated prices through the ranch's legitimate purchasing records. The hidden ledger was his own private accounting of the profits from the arrangement. I was keeping track of what he was taking. She put the ledger back. She closed the storeroom door. Her heart was beating faster than usual, not from fear but from the specific uncomfortable clarity that comes when a suspicion becomes a certainty. She had been careful and patient and methodical for over 2 weeks, telling herself she might be wrong, telling herself she needed to be sure. She was sure now. The question was what to do about it. She made the noon meal on automatic, her hands doing the familiar work while her mind went somewhere else entirely. She laid out the food, the men came in and ate, she cleared and washed and started the preparations for supper. Garrett came through twice, once to take a cup of coffee without speaking to her, once to leave a note on the counter that said simply, "Flour order doubled for next month," with no explanation. She read the note twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her apron pocket and added it to the journal that evening. Doubled. The flour order that was already over what the ranch needed doubled again. And she understood then what she was looking at. Garrett wasn't just skimming from the existing purchases. He was actively expanding the operation, ordering more than was needed so that the inflated difference grew proportionally, and the cash that flowed toward Hendricks and Sons and wherever it went from there grew with it. He was getting bolder. That, she knew from hard experience, was when people like him made mistakes. She needed Wyatt. The problem was getting to him without Garrett knowing. The ranch operated in a way that Garrett had clearly organized deliberately, with himself in the position of most information. He was the one who managed the books, communicated with suppliers, handled the accounts, and served as the primary point of contact between Wyatt and the day-to-day operations. Wyatt trusted him with everything, which meant Wyatt was effectively kept at one remove from the financial reality of his own ranch. If Evelyn went to Wyatt directly, Garrett would know about it within hours. Ranch houses were not large, and Garrett had the kind of spatial awareness that made her believe he was always listening. She needed a reason to speak to Wyatt alone that would not raise any flags. The opportunity came 2 days later, from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Wyatt had a horse, a gray quarter horse named Reckoning, which she thought said something about his sense of humor, or lack of it, that he rode most evenings after supper. She had noticed this pattern in her first week, had filed it alongside the other things she was learning about him. On the 18th evening, she put on her coat after she finished cleaning the kitchen and walked out to the paddock fence where Wyatt was standing, watching Reckoning move along the far side of the pen. He glanced at her when she stopped beside the fence, and then looked back at the horse. "Evening," he said. "Evening." She put her hands on the fence rail. "I need to talk to you about something." "All right." She had practiced this, not the words exactly, but the shape of it, calm, specific, no more than she could prove, no less than he needed to understand that this was serious. She said, "I've been keeping track of the supply orders since I came on. I've noticed some things that don't match." A pause. "What kind of things?" "Prices that are higher than market rate. Quantities that don't correspond to what we're actually using. A supplier, Hendricks and Sons, who appears consistently and whose prices run about 15 to 20% above what they should." Wyatt said nothing. He was still looking at the horse. She couldn't tell what he was thinking, which was frustrating, and she made herself continue without filling the silence with something weaker than what she'd already said. "I'm not saying I have the full picture," she said. "I'm saying what I can see from the kitchen doesn't add up, and I thought you should know." He was quiet for long enough that she began to wonder if she'd miscalculated, if the careful, patient buildup of 3 weeks was about to turn into a conversation where a man told her she was overstepping and suggested she return to her stove. Then he said, "How long have you been tracking this?" "Since the 3rd day?" Another silence. He turned his head and looked at her then, directly, with an expression she couldn't entirely read, but that she thought contained more weight than she had expected. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because I needed to be sure," she said. "I'm sure now." He turned back to the horse. His jaw had tightened, she could see that, and his hands on the fence rail had shifted slightly. "I'll need to see what you have." "I know," she said. "I'll bring it to you, but not in the house." He understood what she wasn't saying. She could tell by the brief, careful stillness that moved through him before he nodded. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Early, before anyone's up. There's a tool shed east of the barn. I'll be there at 4:30. "I'll be there," she said. She walked back to the main house without hurrying, because hurrying would attract attention, and went to her room and sat on the edge of the bed and let herself feel, for exactly 30 seconds, the complicated relief of having said it aloud. Then she opened the journal and went back to work. 4:30 in the morning was full dark and cold, with frost on the ground that crunched under her boots in a way that made her wince with each step. She had the journal tucked inside her coat, against her chest, and she carried a small lantern with the wick turned low. The tool shed was unlocked, as he had said it would be, and Wyatt was already there, standing near the workbench with a lantern of his own. And for a moment they just looked at each other in the dim yellow light, two people who had been talking around something for nearly 3 weeks and had finally stopped. She took out the journal. She laid it on the workbench and opened it to the first page of entries and walked him through it. Not quickly, not dramatically, just clearly, the way she had organized everything in her own head. the supply discrepancies, the pricing pattern, the doubled flour order, the East herd count that didn't match, the hidden ledger in the storeroom, which she described in detail without having brought it, because she had decided that disturbing it again before Wyatt knew about it was a risk she didn't need to take. When she was done, Wyatt stood for a long time with his hands flat on the bench, looking at the journal, and she could see him doing the thing that people do when they are being handed information that rewrites something they believed. The moment when the mind works against itself, looking for the flaw in the new information because the old information is more comfortable. "Garrett's been with me 11 years, he said, not defensively, almost to himself. "I know," she said. "He managed this place through 2 bad droughts and a cattle sickness that nearly broke us." "I know." "And you're telling me he's been—" He stopped. "I'm telling you what the numbers say," she said carefully. "What they mean is your decision." He straightened up. He picked up the journal, turned a few pages, set it down again. His face had gone very still in the way that certain people's faces go still when they are working very hard not to show what they are feeling, and she recognized it because Thomas had had the same quality. "I need to see the ledger," he said. "I know, but carefully." "I know how to be careful." He said it without sharpness, which surprised her. He looked at her directly. "You could have left. After you found it. You could have taken the stage and been gone." "Yes," she said. He seemed to want to ask why she hadn't, and then seemed to decide it didn't matter, or perhaps that he already knew. He closed the journal and held it out to her. She took it. "Don't say anything to anyone," he said. "Not a word. Not to the hands. Not to anyone who comes to the kitchen. Nobody. Garrett can't know we've talked." "He won't know," she said. "Keep doing exactly what you've been doing." He paused. "The food's been good," he said, somewhat awkwardly, as if he'd been meaning to say it, and this seemed as useful a moment as any. She almost smiled. "Thank you." She walked back to the main house in the cold dark, the frost crunching under her boots, and told herself to be careful. Not because she was afraid of what came next, or not only because of that, but because she understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that she had just set something in motion that could not be stopped. She had handed a powerful man a reason to look at his own operation differently, and whatever he found when he looked was going to change things, and not quietly. She was in the kitchen by 5, starting the stove, when she heard Garrett's boots on the floor above her. He came down the back stairs the way he always did, his step heavy and predictable. And he came into the kitchen for his morning coffee the way he always did. She poured it for him without being asked, the way she had learned he preferred, and handed it over. He looked at her. She looked back. "Cold morning," she said. "Colder than yesterday," he said. He took his coffee and left. She turned back to the stove and let the breath out that she had been holding without knowing it. The following 4 days were the most difficult stretch of time she had spent on the ranch, and perhaps among the more difficult stretches of her life, which was saying something. Wyatt went about his days in a way that she could see, if she was watching closely, and she was always watching closely, was deliberately unchanged. He spoke to Garrett as he always had, assigned the same work, ate at the same table, showed nothing. He was, she realized, a genuinely good actor when he needed to be, in the way that people who have been in authority a long time sometimes are. They learn to keep their face from telling their business. But she could see it in small things, the way he spent slightly longer in the office in the evenings, the way his eyes sometimes passed over the ranch's account books on the shelf, with an expression that was just barely not neutral. Garrett did not seem to notice, which meant either that he was too confident to look for it, or that he had already calculated that no one would dare. On the 22nd day, Wyatt knocked on the kitchen door after the evening meal and waited until the last of the hands had left before he stepped inside. He did not sit. He stood near the door, and he said, in a voice that was quiet and level and gave nothing away, "I found the ledger." Evelyn kept her hands busy with the washing up. "And you were right." He paused. "About all of it. More than you knew, actually. There are cattle transfers I can't account for. Sales that didn't go through the main ledger. Money that should have come to the ranch that went somewhere else." She turned to look at him. "How much?" she said. He said a number. It was not $4,000 to $6,000. It was considerably more than that. She set down the dish she was holding and stood with her hands on the edge of the counter, absorbing it. "I've been building it quietly for a week," he said. "I'll need a few more days. Then I'll contact the county sheriff and a lawyer I trust in Dodge City." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to write out everything you found, and when you found it, clean and organized, so it's in your words and can be used if needed." "All right," she said. He was halfway to the door when he stopped and turned back. "I owe you an answer to a question I didn't ask." She waited. "Why you stayed," he said. "Why you didn't just walk away from something that wasn't your problem." She thought about that. About Thomas and the water rights case and the look on his face when he helped her organize the paperwork. About the $4.30 on the nightstand and the worn-out suitcase and the 11 jobs and the cost every time of having stayed too long or left too soon. "Because it was wrong," she said. "And I could see it." She paused. "That's usually enough for me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and left. Outside, the Kansas wind was at it again, low and steady against the walls. Evelyn turned back to the dishes and worked and thought and waited for whatever was coming next, the way she had learned to do. Not with peace exactly, but with the particular steadiness of a woman who had been through enough to know that what's coming is coming regardless, and the only choice she ever really had was how to stand when it arrived. She stood. The arrest happened on a Tuesday. Evelyn knew it was coming, Wyatt had told her the evening before, with the same quiet economy he used for everything, that the sheriff from Dodge City would arrive in the morning and that she should stay in the kitchen and not come out unless he asked her to. She had said all right, and she had meant it. And then she had stood at the kitchen window anyway when she heard the horses in the yard, because she was human and she had spent 3 weeks building toward this moment, and she was not capable of not watching. There were 3 of them, the sheriff and 2 deputies, men she had never seen before, riding in with the particular unhurried authority of people who know they have the law behind them. Wyatt met them in the yard. She couldn't hear what was said. The conversation was brief. Then Wyatt walked toward the bunkhouse and the sheriff followed, and 4 minutes later they came back out with Garrett Voss between the 2 deputies. He was not in chains. They hadn't needed to restrain him, apparently, or perhaps they had decided it was better not to, out here where the ranch hands could see. He walked with his hands at his sides and his back straight, and even from the kitchen window, even across the distance of the yard, Evelyn could see the way his head moved as he walked, turning slightly, checking who was watching. He looked at the bunkhouse, where 3 of the hands had come to the door. He looked at the barn, where 2 more had drifted out. He looked at the main house. His eyes found the kitchen window. She did not step back. He looked at her for 2, maybe 3 seconds. His expression didn't change. She had expected anger or contempt or some visible acknowledgement of what had just happened. Instead, his face was perfectly still in the way that it had always been still, that controlled, watchful flatness that had told her from the beginning exactly what kind of man she was dealing with. He looked at her as if he was cataloging her, filing her away somewhere, noting a detail that would be useful later. Then the deputies moved him toward the waiting wagon, and he looked away, and that was that. She turned back to the stove. Her hands, she noticed, were not shaking. She wasn't sure if that was a good sign or not. The rest of that morning moved strangely, with the too quiet feeling that descends on a place after something significant has happened, and nobody quite knows yet what the new reality looks like. The hands came in for the noon meal and ate without much talk, which was unusual even for them. Clem at the end of the table kept his eyes on his plate the whole time. Ed, the quiet redhead who had told her about the missing cattle, caught her eye once, briefly, and looked away. The young one with the ears, she had learned his name was Tommy, watched her with something that might have been respect, or might have been fear, or might have been both, which was sometimes the same thing in a young man's eyes. Wyatt came in last, ate standing at the counter because the table was full, and left without speaking to anyone. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was carrying the weight of a morning that had involved confronting an 11-year betrayal and coming out the other side of it into a ranch that now had no foreman and a lot of questions the hands were too cautious to ask out loud. She thought about saying something to him. She decided against it. He did not need her comfort right now. He needed time and the particular silence that men like him required when they were reassembling themselves after something hard. She gave him the afternoon. In the evening, when the kitchen was clean and the hands had gone to the bunkhouse, and the main house had gone quiet. She sat at the kitchen table with her journal and wrote out the full account that Wyatt had asked for. Everything she had noticed, in the order she had noticed it, with dates where she could place them and specific details that could be verified. She wrote for 2 hours. Her handwriting was not elegant, but it was clear, the handwriting of a woman who had done her own accounting and correspondence for 20 years. And when she was done, she had 11 pages that laid out, in plain language, exactly what she had seen and when and what she had concluded from it. She left it on the kitchen table for Wyatt, weighted down with the salt cellar, and went to bed. She slept better that night than she had in 3 weeks. She was wrong to. The first sign came 4 days later, in the form of a woman she had never seen before who came into Raven Creek's general store while Evelyn was there picking up a few items she'd needed since the last supply run. The woman was perhaps 60, with the upright posture of someone who had once been attractive and had made her identity out of it. She looked at Evelyn the way certain women look at other women they have already decided something about, and said loudly enough for the 2 other people in the store to hear, "So you're the one." Evelyn looked at her. "I don't know that I am," she said. "I'm Evelyn Hartwell. I cook at Raven Creek Ranch." "I know who you are," the woman said. "We all know who you are." She left before Evelyn could ask what that meant. On the walk back to the ranch, Evelyn turned it over. "We all know who you are." In a town the size of Raven Creek, something had already been said. Some version of events had already circulated that cast her in a role she hadn't chosen. She tried to think about what Garrett Voss, sitting in a jail cell in Dodge City, might have had the time and the means to communicate to people here, and the thinking made her stomach tighten in a way she didn't like. She said nothing to Wyatt about the woman in the store. She needed to understand the shape of it first. The shape of it became clearer over the following week, and it was uglier than she had anticipated. It started as whispers, the kind that stop when you enter a room. She heard fragments, not enough to be sure, but enough to get the general direction. The story that was traveling through Raven Creek was not the story of a foreman who had stolen from his employer and been caught. The story that was traveling was something quite different. In the version people were telling each other, Garrett Voss was a loyal employee of many years who had been framed by a cunning woman who had arrived at the ranch with a plan already in motion. A woman who had cultivated Wyatt Callahan's trust in order to take control of the ranch's operations, and who had fabricated evidence to remove the one man standing between her and that goal. It was, she had to admit, a well-constructed lie. It had the particular architecture of a story built by someone intelligent, someone who understood that the most effective falsehood is the one that contains just enough truth to be plausible. She had arrived with nothing. She had quickly reorganized the kitchen. She had gained Wyatt's trust. She had, by her own account, been going through the ranch's records and keeping notes. She had brought Wyatt information that resulted in his foreman of 11 years being arrested. Every one of those things was true. The story that was being told about them was a lie. She understood, with a cold and particular clarity, that this had been planned, not improvised in a jail cell. There hadn't been time for that. This had been prepared in advance, the way a man who knows he might be caught prepares his defense before the moment comes. Garrett Voss had anticipated the possibility of exposure and had built a counter-narrative, and now he was deploying it through whatever channels remained available to him, and it was working with the brutal efficiency of a story that confirms what people already want to believe about a woman who came from nowhere and asked powerful men to listen to her. The second sign came from Tommy. He came to her on a Thursday morning, while the other hands were at the barn, and he stood in the kitchen door with his hat in his hands, and his expression caught between guilt and something that looked like genuine distress. She had learned to like Tommy over the past weeks. He was young and not always sensible, but he had a basic decency about him that she trusted. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Tommy," she said. He turned the hat in his hands. "People in town are saying things." "I know." "Bad things." He looked up. "About you and about why you came here. About it being planned." "I know," she said again. "I don't believe it," he said quickly, as if he was afraid he wouldn't say it if he didn't say it fast. "I ate the food from before, and I ate your food, and you didn't. You weren't here doing anything except trying to do the job right." He stopped. "That's all I wanted to say?" She looked at him. He was maybe 17, possibly 18, with the kind of earnest, unguarded face that the frontier usually cured a person of by the time they reached 25. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. He nodded, put his hat back on, and left. She stood in the kitchen and let herself feel, for 30 seconds, the gratitude and the anger side by side, because they were both there and both real. And then she set them both aside and started thinking about what to do. Wyatt came to her that evening. She could see the trouble on him when he walked through the door. He was carrying more of it than he had been carrying even the day of the arrest, which surprised her, because she had thought the hardest thing was already behind them. He sat down at the kitchen table, which he had never done before. He was always moving, always vertical, always on his way somewhere. The act of sitting was itself a signal. "You've heard," he said. "I've heard." "How much?" "Enough," she said. She sat down across from him because he clearly needed someone to sit across from. "Garrett planned it." "I know." His jaw worked. "There's a man in town, Sully Reeves, owns the grain merchant, who says Garrett told him, weeks ago, that he was concerned about my new cook, that she seemed to be asking too many questions about things that weren't her business." He put his hands flat on the table. "Weeks ago. Before I even knew what you'd found." She absorbed that. He was covering himself. He was covering himself. Wyatt's voice was controlled, but she could hear what was underneath it. The particular fury of a man who has discovered that someone he trusted was not only stealing from him, but had been preparing for the moment of exposure with careful, patient intelligence. He's been talking to people. His lawyer is saying the evidence was that you had access to the records because I gave it to you, and that you could have... He stopped, looked at the table. That you could have altered things. She was quiet for a moment. Could the records have been altered before I got here? Wyatt looked up. I mean by Garrett, she said, not by me. Is it possible that some of what we found has been changed since the arrest? Not in the hidden ledger, but in the official records. He was very still. I hadn't considered that. If he had someone still on the ranch, she said carefully, or someone with access to the house. Nobody has access to the study except me, and... He stopped again, and she could see him running through the list of people who had keys to things, who knew where things were kept, who had been in and out of the main house over the past week while the ordinary business of a working ranch continued. Nobody should, he said. No, she agreed. They sat with that for a moment. I need to check the records, he said. Compare them against what I copied out before the arrest. You made copies. The lawyer told me to. He said it with a flicker of something that might almost have been dark humor. First useful thing a lawyer ever told me. She almost smiled. Not quite. What do you need from me? He looked at her across the table, and she thought he was about to say nothing, or stay out of it, or one of the several versions of this is not your problem anymore that men offered women when they wanted them to step back from the thing they had started. She had heard all the versions. She had learned which battles to fight over it, and which to let go. Instead, he said, I need you to write out a timeline. Everything you found, and when you found it, as specific as you can be about dates and times. And I need you to note anything that would be impossible to have changed because it happened before you arrived, or because there's a physical record somewhere that isn't in the study. I can do that, she said. Tonight, he said. Tonight, she agreed. He stood. Evelyn. He had not used her first name before. She noticed it without reacting. This is going to get worse before it gets better. I need you to know that going in. I already know that, she said. He nodded and left. She wrote for 3 hours that night, and what emerged was something more comprehensive than she had intended. Not just a timeline, but a document that cross-referenced dates with events, identified which records could be independently verified through external sources, and noted the specific physical characteristics of the hidden ledger that made it impossible to attribute to anyone who had arrived at the ranch after it was hidden. She was meticulous in a way that came from fear, she acknowledged to herself, not of Garrett Voss, but of the specific vulnerability of being a woman whose word was the primary evidence of her own integrity. She had been here before, not with this exact set of circumstances, but with the fundamental situation, the moment where everything she had done could be reframed by someone with more power and better connections. And her only defense was the precision and completeness of her own account. She had been through it once in Abilene, when the woman who employed her had decided to blame a missing set of household silver on the cook, rather than the woman's own nephew, who had a known fondness for anything he could sell. Evelyn had kept records then, too. It had not made the situation painless, but it had made it survivable. She finished writing at midnight and went to bed. In the morning, she went to the general store. She needed supplies, but more than that, she needed to hear what was being said. She went in, bought what she needed, and kept her manner neutral and her ears open. And what she heard in the 15 minutes she was there was enough to tell her that the story had grown. It had acquired details it hadn't had before. Now there was a version circulating that specified Evelyn had connections to a land agent in Wichita who was interested in acquiring failing Kansas ranches, that she had been sent to Raven Creek specifically, had targeted Wyatt Callahan specifically, and that Garrett Voss had been the obstacle between her and a fraudulent takeover scheme. She heard this from two separate conversations, neither of which involved her directly. She caught it in the way you catch things in a small town, from the edges of other people's words. She kept her face neutral and paid for her goods and left. On the walk back, the cold Kansas air sharp against her face, she did something she rarely did. She let herself be afraid for a few minutes. Not paralyzed, not despairing, but honestly afraid, the way you had to let yourself be if you wanted to be honest about what you were dealing with. This was not just someone spreading rumors. The detail about the land agent, the specificity of it, the geographic specificity, told her this had been researched. Someone with real information gathering capability had constructed this alternative narrative, and it had been seeded into the community through multiple channels simultaneously. Garrett Voss had not done that from a jail cell. Someone else was involved. She was still working through that thought when she got back to the ranch and found Wyatt in the yard, and saw from his face that something had happened. "Inside," he said. She followed him into the study, a room she had never been in before, lined with shelves of ledgers and a large desk that was currently covered in papers. He closed the door behind them. "Someone's been in here," he said. She looked at the papers on the desk. To her eye, they looked like organized disorder, the normal chaos of a working man's desk. "How can you tell?" "The records I made copies of." He pointed to a section of the shelf. "I kept them in order, specific order, because I'm particular about it. 3 of them are out of sequence. Small, someone put them back carefully, but not the way I keep them." She looked at the shelf. "When?" "Last night, I think. I was in here until 9. Everyone was at the bunkhouse by 8:30. "Not everyone," she said. He looked at her. "Who has a reason to still be here?" she said. "In the house, with access to this room, after 9 at night?" He thought about it. "Nobody should," he said, for the second time in 2 days, and this time there was an edge under the words that told her he understood the difference between should and is. They stood in the study with the papers between them and thought about it together, which felt, Evelyn noticed, like a significant shift from where they had been 3 weeks ago. "I need to count what's been changed," he said. "If anything, I'll compare the copies against the originals tonight." "I'll help," she said. He started to object. She could see it forming. And she met his eyes, and he changed his mind. "All right," he said. They spent the evening at the study desk, going through the comparison page by page, Wyatt reading the originals, and Evelyn reading from the copies he had made, checking for discrepancies. It was painstaking work, and it was not how she had expected to spend an evening. It occurred to her, somewhere around the 3rd hour, that 3 months ago she had been sitting in a rented room in Wichita wondering if she was going to be able to hold on to enough money to keep the room through the winter, and now she was sitting in a ranch owner's study going through financial records by lamplight, and she was not sure which version of her life was stranger. They found 2 changes. Both were minor. Both involved specific line items in the official cattle transfer records from 18 months ago, records that, if read in the altered version, suggested the numbers had been manipulated in a way that pointed away from Garrett and toward a broader accounting error, the kind of error that a clever defense attorney could point to as evidence that the records were generally unreliable and therefore could not be used to establish specific criminal intent. "He's building a defense," Evelyn said. "His lawyer is," Wyatt said, "through someone still on the ranch." Wyatt's jaw had gone tight. "Or someone who knows the ranch well enough." She looked at him. 11 years is a long time. Did Garrett have anyone here before? Anyone who came with him, or who came because of him, or who left when he came and might be connected to him still? Wyatt was quiet for a long time. She watched him working through it, Going back through years of personnel decisions, the way you go through a house you've lived in, looking for something you thought you knew the location of. There was a man, he said finally. Came on the same year as Garrett, left about 2 years later, said he was going to try his luck in Colorado. Name was Hicks. I never thought anything of it. He paused. But he and Garrett were close. And last month, I'd forgotten this until now, one of the hands mentioned seeing a man fitting Hicks's description in Raven Creek. She said nothing. If Hicks never went to Colorado, Wyatt said slowly, if he's been in the area, then he could have been the arrangement on this end, she said. The person who handled things locally, the one who knew the ranch, knew the layout, knew which records were kept where. And still does, Wyatt said. The room went quiet. The lamp on the desk was running low on oil and the light was beginning to amber and contract. I need to contact the lawyer in Dodge City tomorrow, Wyatt said, and the sheriff. These alterations need to be documented tonight, the originals and the copies both, with a signed statement from both of us about when we found them. I'll write it out, she said. I know you will. He looked at her across the lamplight. You're very good at writing things down. It wasn't quite a compliment. It wasn't quite anything she had a word for. I've had to, she said. He nodded, and they went back to work. The signed statement took another hour. By the time she walked from the study to her room, the house was fully dark and the wind had picked up outside, driving a low sound under the eaves that she had grown used to, but that still, on certain nights, made her feel the enormousness of where she was and how alone she had been when she arrived. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the nightstand. There was no 4:30 in the morning meeting this time, no journal to consult, no list of things she had not yet figured out. She had been meticulous and careful, and it had led to an arrest that had led to something worse than what she had expected, and she was going to have to be even more careful now, and she was tired in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with the hour. She thought about Garrett Voss's face when they led him out of the bunkhouse, the stillness of it, the way his eyes had found her at the kitchen window. He had told her, that first evening, not to concern herself with things that weren't her business. She had spent her whole life concerning herself with things that other people had decided were not her business. It had cost her in ways she couldn't always fully account for. It had also, on balance, been the most honest version of herself she knew how to be. She thought about the land agent detail, the specificity of it, the way it had been seeded through multiple conversations simultaneously, the way it had been built to stick, to carry the particular weight of something that sounds like insider knowledge. That wasn't Garrett working through proxies from a jail cell. That was something else, someone else, who had access to enough real information about her to construct something plausible out of it. The land agent in Wichita. She had used a hiring agent in Wichita to find the position at Raven Creek. A woman named Mrs. Beale, who ran a respectable agency and who had placed Evelyn in 2 previous positions without incident. But hiring agents talked to each other, and hiring agents knew her employment history, her references, her previous positions, the towns she had moved through. Anyone who wanted to know where Evelyn Hartwell had been and who she had worked for and what she had done could have gotten a significant portion of that information through channels that were perfectly legitimate. Someone had. She lay back on the bed without taking her boots off and looked at the ceiling. The question was who had mattered enough to research her. The story about the land agent was fabricated. She had no connection to any land agent and never had. But the fabrication had been built on a framework of real information, and that meant someone had taken the trouble of acquiring real information about her before she had done anything at all at Raven Creek Ranch, which meant the research had been done before Garrett was exposed, which meant someone had been watching this situation before it became a situation. She pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes and thought. Thomas had a brother. She had not thought about Nathan Graves, and she could not remember the last time she had let herself think about Nathan Graves. He was Thomas's half-brother from his father's first marriage, 11 years older than Thomas, a man she had met precisely 4 times in the 8 years of her marriage, and had disliked precisely 4 times. He had contested Thomas's will. He had lost, but not cleanly. The county court had decided in Evelyn's favor, but Nathan had made it expensive and slow and unpleasant, and she had spent more of her small inheritance on legal fees than she ever told anyone. He had not bothered to hide the fact that he thought Thomas's assets should have come to him as the eldest son, and that the woman Thomas had married was an obstacle to a rightful inheritance. She had not heard from Nathan Graves in 2 years. She had assumed the silence meant the situation was over. She had been wrong about that before. She sat up. The hiring agency in Wichita, her previous positions, the specific detail of a land agent, the kind of business Nathan had been involved in, peripherally, on the edges of a dozen schemes she had heard Thomas mention with a kind of weary resignation over the years. Nathan's always got something going, Thomas had said once. You don't want to know what? She hadn't wanted to know. She should have wanted to know. She got up, pulled her journal from her coat pocket, and sat back down on the edge of the bed and wrote Nathan Graves's name at the top of a new page. Then she wrote down everything she knew about him, which was less than she wished and more than she'd thought. And by the time she was done, the shape of what was happening had shifted again into something darker and more personal than a foreman's theft from a ranch. And she sat with her boots on the edge of the bed in the dark Kansas night and understood that what she was in the middle of had roots she hadn't known about until right now. She was not going to be able to walk away from it. She had never been able to walk away from things that were wrong. Outside, the wind pushed against the wall, steady and indifferent, the way the Kansas frontier pushed back against everything that tried to make a home in it. Evelyn Hartwell had been pushing back against things her whole life. She was tired. She was 41 years old and tired and a long way from anything that had ever felt like home. But she was not done. She closed the journal. She lay back on the bed. And in the darkness, she began to plan. She told Wyatt about Nathan Graves the next morning. She had spent part of the night deciding how much to say and in what order, not because she wanted to hide anything from him, but because she understood that the way information lands matters as much as the information itself. Wyatt Callahan was a man who processed things sequentially. She had learned that about him over the past weeks, and dumping everything at once would have been like pouring water too fast into a narrow-mouthed jar. Most of it would spill. So she waited until after breakfast, when the hands had gone out and the kitchen was quiet, and she asked him to sit down, which he did with the slightly wary expression of a man who has recently learned that sitting down in the kitchen means he is about to hear something that requires it. She told him about Thomas first, not the grief of it. That wasn't what this conversation needed, but the basic facts. Husband. Died 18 months ago. Small farm outside Abilene. A will that left everything to Evelyn, which was not a large everything, but it was what there was. Then she told him about Nathan. She kept it plain. The contested will. The legal fees. The 4 meetings, none of them warm. The particular quality of Nathan Graves's grievance. Not hot anger, but the cold, patient kind, the kind that doesn't go away when it loses in court because it has simply relocated and begun accumulating resources for the next attempt. Wyatt listened without interrupting, which she had come to recognize as one of his better qualities. The land agent detail, she said. The one in the story going around town. That's the kind of business Nathan was connected to. Not directly, he was always indirect, but he moved in those circles. He knew people in property acquisition. He knew how to make something sound like inside knowledge when it was actually constructed. You think he built the story, Wyatt said. I think he provided the material for it. I don't think he and Garrett Voss sat down together and planned this from the beginning. But I think Nathan found out I was here, through the hiring agency, or through someone in Wichita who knew someone. And he saw an opportunity. If Garrett needed an alternative narrative, Nathan could supply it. And in exchange, she paused. In exchange for what? Wyatt said. I don't know yet, she admitted. That's the piece I'm missing. He was quiet for a moment. If Garrett had money from the ranch, a significant amount, and needed a way to move it, to clean it, someone with connections in land and property could be useful. She looked at him. Yes. And if Nathan had a grievance against you specifically, then being the person who destroyed my reputation while also laundering stolen money would serve 2 purposes at once, she said. Wyatt sat with that. Outside, she could hear the distant sound of the hands working, someone hammering, the particular hollow sound of wood against wood, and the ordinary noise of the ranch going about its business, while the people inside the main house tried to understand what was being done to them. How much of this can you prove? He said. None of it yet, she said. I know Nathan. I know how he operates. That's not proof. No, he agreed. It isn't. He stood up, pushed the chair back in, stood with his hands on the top rail of it. I'm going to Dodge City tomorrow. The lawyer needs to know about this. The sheriff, too. He looked at her. I'd like you to come. She had not expected that. Why? Because the lawyer will want to talk to you directly, and because he stopped. Something moved across his face that was not quite discomfort, but was in that neighborhood. Because I'd rather have you where I can see what's happening than here alone where I can't. It was not a particularly elegant thing to say. She appreciated it for that reason. All right, she said. They left the following morning before the sun was fully up, with Tommy left in charge of the kitchen. She had spent an hour the evening before walking him through what needed to be done, which he had received with the intense focus of someone who understood they were being trusted with something real, and two of the older hands left to manage the ranch's daily operations. Wyatt had said nothing to anyone about where they were going or why, which meant by noon the hands would have speculated their way to half a dozen wrong answers, but that couldn't be helped. The ride to Dodge City took most of the day. They rode in Wyatt's wagon, which was more practical than romantic, with a canvas cover that cut the wind in completely and a seat that had not been well padded since approximately 1871. Evelyn spent the first part of the journey going over her written account again, in her head, testing it for gaps and inconsistencies, and the second part of it watching the Kansas landscape roll past with that particular quality it had in the late morning, enormous and flat and faintly golden, the kind of landscape that made you feel either very free or very exposed depending on your current situation. She was currently feeling exposed. Wyatt drove without talking much, which suited her. They said necessary things, how far to the next water, whether the left rear wheel sounded wrong, whether they should stop at the way station, and left the larger conversation for later, which was also something she had come to recognize about him. He did not talk around what mattered. He waited until he was ready to talk about it directly, and then he did. About 2 hours out of Dodge City, he said without preamble, "I should have seen it myself." She waited. "The accounts," he said. "The pattern. I had the same numbers in front of me that you had. I just didn't. I trusted Garrett to interpret them, and I stopped looking at them directly." He kept his eyes on the road. "That's not a mistake I should have been making." "You were running a cattle ranch," she said. "You can't manage every piece of it yourself." "No, but I can stay close enough to the money to notice when it's going wrong." He paused. 11 years. He was here 11 years and I never... He shook his head. "I keep coming back to that number." She understood what he was really saying, which was not about the accounting. "You trusted him," she said. "That's not stupidity. That's how trust works. It's always a risk." "Not much comfort." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They rode in silence for a while. The road was rutted from recent rain and the wagon moved with a rhythmic jolt that was just regular enough to be annoying. "Thomas," Wyatt said. "Your husband. What was he like?" She had not expected that. She looked at the side of his face. He was still watching the road, jaw slightly tight, not looking at her, in the way that people ask personal questions when they don't want to be seen asking them. "Practical," she said after a moment. "Not a big talker. He worked hard and he was honest about it. About what the work was, what it cost, what it gave back." She paused. "He helped me with things. That sounds small, but it wasn't. When I had something I needed to do that was going to make my life harder, he didn't try to talk me out of it. He helped me do it better." Wyatt said nothing. "He would have liked this," she said, and then stopped, because she hadn't meant to say that. "Liked what?" Wyatt said. She looked at the road ahead of them. "This situation, not the being accused of things I didn't do, but the puzzle of it. Finding out what's actually happening and going after the truth of it. He'd have been right in the middle of it." Wyatt glanced at her then, briefly. "So would you," he said. "You already are." She didn't say anything to that, but she thought about it for the rest of the ride. The lawyer's office in Dodge City was on the second floor of a building on Front Street, up a narrow staircase that smelled of old paper and tobacco, with a door that opened into a room that was mostly desk and mostly covered in documents stacked with the organized density of a man who understood his own system even if no one else could. The lawyer's name was Calloway, Hector Calloway, a compact man in his late 50s with gold-rimmed spectacles and the kind of careful, methodical intelligence that announced itself not through quickness, but through the quality of the silences between his sentences. He had met with Wyatt before, she gathered. There was the ease of established dealing between them, and he turned his attention to Evelyn with the directness she found, after everything, almost refreshing. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, "tell me about Nathan Graves." So she did. Calloway listened with his hands flat on the desk and his spectacles directed at her face, and he did not write anything down while she talked, which meant he was either relying on memory or he was testing her first to decide if it was worth writing down. She told it in order, plainly, without embellishment, and she watched him for reaction and saw very little, which was probably the point. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Do you have any documentation connecting Nathan Graves to either Garrett Voss or to the land acquisition circles you've described?" "Not yet," she said, "but you believe the connection exists." "I believe it's the most coherent explanation for how a story that specific got into circulation that fast," she said. "Someone fed Raven Creek information that required access to my personal history. Nathan Graves is the person with both the motive and the access." Calloway looked at Wyatt. "What's your assessment?" "She's been right about everything else," Wyatt said. Calloway turned his spectacles back to Evelyn. "I'll need to investigate Nathan Graves independently. If he has connections to property acquisition in the region, there will be a financial trail. Men who operate in that space leave records. They have to, in order to do business. Finding the records is a matter of knowing where to look." He picked up a pen. "I'm going to need your written account, the one you mentioned in your letter, and a signed statement from both of you about the alterations found in the study." They spent the next 2 hours in Calloway's office, working through what they had, what they could prove, and what would need to be established. Calloway was meticulous and occasionally pointed. He challenged 2 of Evelyn's conclusions, asked her to prove them from the primary documents, rather than inference, and when she could, he noted it, and when she couldn't, he told her flatly what she would need to find. She did not find this unpleasant. She found it useful in the way that a whetstone is useful, uncomfortable, and necessary. At one point, he looked at her over his spectacles and said, "You kept very good records." "I've had to," she said, for the second time in a week. He looked at her a beat longer than necessary. "Yes," he said. "I expect you have." The sheriff's office was their next stop. The sheriff himself, a man named Aldridge, with a gray mustache and a deliberate manner, listened to what they had found about the alterations in the study records and the possible connection to someone named Hicks who might be in the area. He did not seem surprised by any of it, which surprised her, until he said, "Voss asked for a meeting with his lawyer 3 days after the arrest. We couldn't hear the conversation, but his lawyer came out and made 3 separate inquiries in town that same afternoon. One of them was about property law in Ford County." Wyatt said, "Relevant property." "Possibly," Aldridge said. He looked at Evelyn. "Ma'am, I'll be straight with you. The complaint that's been filed, and there is a formal complaint filed 2 days ago, names you specifically as a party to potential fraud related to the financial manipulation at Raven Creek Ranch." The room was very quiet. "Who filed it?" she said. "A man named Nathan Graves," Aldridge said, "out of Wichita. Claims to be the surviving family of your late husband and says he has evidence of a pattern of financial misconduct in your previous positions. She had known it was coming. She had known it since the night she had written Nathan's name at the top of the page in her journal. Knowing it was coming did not make hearing it easier." "What evidence?" Wyatt said, and his voice had an edge in it that she noted. "Forged letters," Aldridge said, "or letters that appear to be forged, in my estimation, though I'm not a documents expert. They purport to be correspondence between Mrs. Hartwell and a land agent discussing the acquisition of distressed properties, including, in one letter, a specific mention of Raven Creek Ranch." She looked at Aldridge steadily. "Those letters are fabricated." "I expect they are," he said, with the calm of a man who has been doing this long enough to have a working sense of the difference. "But expecting and proving are 2 different things, and until a court decides the matter, they exist as an instrument." He paused. "There will be a hearing, probably within the week. Graves has a lawyer, and the lawyer is pushing for speed." Speed, of course. Speed was how you kept the other side from having time to prepare. She sat with her hands in her lap and thought about the letters. Forged. Written to look like her hand, probably. She tried to think about who had a sample of her handwriting, and the answer was anyone she had ever worked for, anyone she had sent correspondence to through the hiring agency, anyone who had received a letter from her in the last 20 years, which was not a small group. Forging a woman's handwriting was not difficult if you had enough samples and enough time, and Nathan had been collecting samples for 2 years without her knowing he was doing it. She thought about what Calloway had said. Finding the records is a matter of knowing where to look. The letters mentioned specific dates, she said. Aldridge checked the file in front of him. The earliest is dated 14 months ago. 14 months ago, she said. I was in Abilene 14 months ago, working for a woman named Clara Dobbins on Prospect Street. I was there for 6 months. Mrs. Dobbins is alive and well and has my previous employer's reference in her files if she hasn't thrown it out. She looked at Aldridge. If the letter is dated from the period I was in Abilene, it will have a location or a postmark. Does it? He looked. Wichita, he said. Then it's already wrong, she said. I wasn't in Wichita 14 months ago. I didn't go to Wichita until after I left Abilene, which was 8 months ago. Clara Dobbins can verify the dates. The hiring agency has records. And if the letter was postmarked Wichita in a month when I was in Abilene, the letter is impossible. Aldridge looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Wyatt. Then he wrote something down. That's useful, he said. There will be more like it, she said. Whoever forged the letters had my handwriting samples and my general history, but they didn't have a precise timeline of my movements. I kept one. I can have it to you by tomorrow. Calloway, who had accompanied them to the sheriff's office, said, from his chair in the corner, I'll verify it independently. He looked at Aldridge. We'll want a documents examiner to look at the letters before the hearing. I'll arrange it, Aldridge said. They left the sheriff's office in the early afternoon, with the sun lower now and the Dodge City street busy with the ordinary traffic of a working frontier town. Evelyn walked beside Wyatt toward the wagon and felt the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort but from sustained concentration, the kind that lives behind the eyes and in the back of the neck. Are you all right? Wyatt said. She considered the question honestly. I'm angry, she said. I'm tired, and I'm fairly certain we're going to win this, which helps. He looked at her sideways. Fairly certain. I try not to be more certain than the evidence warrants, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, exactly, but something adjacent to it. That's a reasonable approach. They stopped at a hotel for the night rather than making the return journey in the dark. It was a practical decision, and it was made practically, with Evelyn taking a room on the second floor and Wyatt taking one on the first, and no drama about it, which she appreciated. She had been in enough situations where a woman traveling with a man who was not her husband became a subject of commentary, and she was too tired for commentary. She sat in the room and looked out the window at the Dodge City street below and did not think about the hearing for exactly 10 minutes, by deliberate choice, because she had learned that there was a point at which additional thinking became circular and less useful than rest. Then she thought about the forged letters. The location error, Wichita versus Abilene, was the weak point in Nathan's construction. It was the kind of mistake a person made when they were working from general knowledge rather than precise information. Nathan knew she had been in Wichita eventually. He knew it had been roughly in that period. But he didn't know the exact sequence because he had not been tracking her closely enough in that specific window, and so he had placed the letter in the wrong city by a margin of months. She was going to need Clara Dobbins. She wrote herself a note to contact her through the post first thing in the morning. She was also going to need someone who had interacted with Nathan Graves in the context of land dealings in the region. Not hearsay, actual documented interaction, a contract, an inquiry, a record of correspondence with a property agent. Something that put him in the same professional network as the kind of operation the rumor in Raven Creek had described. She opened her journal to the Nathan Graves page and started writing what she knew about his business contacts from the 2 years of Thomas's occasional, resigned mentions. It was not a lot. Thomas had not liked to talk about Nathan, and she had not pressed him. But there were names, 2, maybe 3, that she could put down, men Thomas had mentioned in connection with Nathan's various schemes, men who operated in property and land in Kansas and the surrounding territories. One name she had heard twice, Harlan Driscoll. A property broker out of Wichita, Thomas had said once, with the tone of someone describing a type of weather they found unpleasant. Driscoll does the paperwork. Nathan provides the connections. They find properties that are in trouble and they move in. Harlan Driscoll, Wichita. She wrote it down and circled it. In the morning, she gave the name to Calloway at his office before they left for the ranch. He looked at it, wrote it in his own notes, and said, If Driscoll and Graves have a documented business relationship, and Driscoll can be connected to any property inquiry touching Raven Creek, that establishes the motive behind the fabricated narrative. He looked at her. Well done. She said, I don't know that he can be connected yet. That's what we find out, Calloway said. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than the ride out, which was not because things were worse, but because they were both tired and had spent their words in Dodge City and had very little left for the road. About an hour out, Wyatt said, When this is over. She waited. He seemed to be having some trouble with the sentence. She let him have the trouble without rescuing him from it. When this is over, he said again, there'll need to be changes at the ranch. A new foreman, a better system for the accounts, something with more oversight. I've been thinking about what that looks like. She said nothing because she was not sure where he was going. I'd want someone who understood the financial side, he said. Not just the cattle operations, but the supply chain, the purchasing, the record keeping. Someone who had already demonstrated they could see through to what was actually happening when the numbers didn't match. She looked at the road ahead of them. That's a different job than cook, she said. Yes, he said. You'd need to think carefully about whether the ranch hands would accept that kind of authority from a woman, he said. I was going to say from someone new, she said. But yes, that too. He drove for a moment. Clem respects you, Ed too, which is harder to earn. Tommy would follow you off a cliff at this point. He paused. I've watched how the men are around you. It's different than it was 3 weeks ago. She thought about the molasses cookies and the dried apple turnovers and the conversations she had listened to at the end of long days when the men were too tired to be guarded. Food helps, she said. It isn't the food, he said. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. They see that you're not performing anything, he said. You're just doing what needs doing. People respond to that, even people who didn't want to. She turned back to the road. The ranch was still 2 hours away, and the afternoon light was long and golden across the flat Kansas plain, and she sat with what he had said and what it meant and what it would mean to say yes to it. She wasn't ready to say yes yet. She was not even sure the offer had been made in clear enough terms to be yesed or noed, but she filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that were real and needed to be returned to. They arrived back at the ranch in the late afternoon to find Tommy standing on the porch with an expression on his face that told her immediately something had happened. What is it? She said, before she had even climbed down from the wagon. A man came, Tommy said. This morning. Said he was here about a legal matter. I told him Mr. Callahan wasn't here and he should come back, but Tommy's jaw tightened. He didn't leave. He went around to the back of the barn, and when I went to find him, he was talking to Clem. Wyatt was down from the wagon. What did the man look like? Tommy described him. Medium height, heavier build, dark coat, black hat with a flat brim, something off about his left hand, a scar or a deformity, Tommy wasn't sure. Evelyn said, without meaning to, Hicks. Wyatt looked at her. The description fits, she said. What Thomas described to me once about Nathan's people. A man with something wrong with his left hand. She looked at Tommy. Where's Clem now? At the barn, Tommy said. He won't talk to me. He just told me to mind my own. Wyatt walked toward the barn without another word. Evelyn followed, slightly behind, because she understood this was his confrontation to have first. Clem was inside, working on a piece of harness with the focused attention of a man who is working so that he does not have to talk. He looked up when Wyatt came in, and something in his face shifted. Not guilt exactly, but something older and more complicated than guilt. The look of a man who has been carrying something for a long time and has made a decision he is not entirely comfortable with. Clem, Wyatt said. Boss, Clem said. Who was the man? Not a question. Clem set the harness down. He looked at his hands for a moment, the way older men look at their hands when they are trying to figure out how to say something true. Name's Hicks, he said. I know him from before I came here. He paused. He wanted to know about the woman. He didn't look at Evelyn. What she did here. What she had access to. Who she talked to. And? Wyatt said. And I told him to go to hell, Clem said. He looked up then, directly at Wyatt, with the steady look of a man who wants credit for making the right choice, even if he wants credit for nothing else. I told him what he was doing was wrong, and I wanted no part of it. Then I came back in here. The barn was very quiet. Did he say who sent him? Wyatt said. Didn't have to, Clem said. I know Hicks. I know who he works for. He worked for Garrett, time to time, over the years, and whoever's pulling Garrett's strings from outside. He looked at his hands again. I knew something was wrong with the accounts. I've known for a while. I had a family once. Lost them. This place was the only thing I had left, and I was afraid of losing it if I made noise. He stopped. That's not an excuse. No, Wyatt said. It isn't. The silence stretched between them with everything that had gone unsaid for years lying in it, heavy and specific. Tell me everything Hicks said, Wyatt said. Every word. Clem told him. It took 20 minutes, and what emerged from those 20 minutes was a confirmation of what Evelyn had pieced together the night she had written Nathan Graves's name in her journal, but with details she hadn't had. The specific name of the property broker who had received inquiries about Raven Creek, the name of a bank in Wichita where money had been moved, the fact that Nathan Graves had been to Raven Creek himself, once, 6 months before Evelyn had arrived, under a different name, to look at what he was planning to take. Evelyn stood in the barn and listened and felt the pieces settle into the shape she had suspected, and the shape was worse than what she had built in her mind because it was real and specific and had a history that predated her arrival by more than half a year. She had not walked into a situation. The situation had been built around her, with her name in it, before she had done anything at all. When Clem was done, Wyatt stood for a moment with his hands at his sides, and then he turned to Evelyn. I need to send a wire to Callaway tonight, he said. The bank in Wichita, she said. If money moved through there are records. And Nathan was here, Wyatt said, under a false name. That's criminal fraud, not just defamation. We need to get the name he used, she said. If he registered at a hotel or did any formal business under that name, it's traceable. Wyatt looked at Clem. Did Hicks say what name Graves used when he came to town? Clem thought about it. Something plain, something easy to forget. He frowned. Morrison, he said. Thomas Morrison. The name of Evelyn's late husband. Thomas. She said nothing. She stood very still and felt something cold and quiet move through her. Thomas Morrison. Nathan had used Thomas's first name as his alias. It might have been coincidence. Morrison was a common enough surname, but she did not believe in that particular coincidence. Wyatt was watching her face. Evelyn. I'm fine, she said. And she was. She was fine in the way that you are fine when you are angry at a level that has gone past heat and become something colder and more useful. Send the wire, she said. Tell Callaway we have a name and a bank and a witness who can testify. And tell him we'll be ready for the hearing whenever it comes. She walked out of the barn into the late afternoon light, and the Kansas sky above her was enormous and pale and indifferent, and she stood in it for a moment with her hands at her sides and breathed. Nathan Graves had used her dead husband's name to come and look at what he planned to take from her. She had nothing left to feel afraid about. She walked back to the kitchen and started supper. The hearing was set for a Thursday. Callaway sent word by wire 3 days before, with the kind of brevity that told her he had been busy and that the brevity was not indifference but efficiency. The message said the document's examiner had completed his review of the forged letters, that Clara Dobbins had responded to Evelyn's post with a signed and dated statement confirming the precise months of Evelyn's employment in Abilene, and that the bank records from Wichita were being subpoenaed. It also said, at the end, in the same plain style, be prepared. Graves's lawyer is aggressive and the strategy will be to rattle you. Don't be rattled. She read the wire twice, folded it, and put it in her coat pocket next to her journal. She had $4.30 when she arrived at Raven Creek Ranch. She had slightly more than that now. Wyatt had been paying her wages without interruption through all of it, which she had not taken for granted. But not so much more that losing this hearing would feel like anything other than the end of something she could not rebuild from. She was 41 years old. She had used her last reference and her last name on a list to get this job. If Nathan Graves and Garrett Voss won their constructed story, she would leave Raven Creek not just unemployed, but marked, a woman with a formal fraud complaint against her name, and in a territory where people talked, that marking would follow her into every kitchen and every hiring agent's office from here to the Missouri border. She knew all of that. She had been living with all of that for days. She had also been cooking supper every night and breakfast every morning, and tracking the supply orders and showing Tommy how to properly seal a flour sack so the weevils couldn't get in, and doing all the ordinary things that needed doing regardless of what was happening in courtrooms and lawyers' offices. Because that was the other thing she had learned across 41 years of a life that had not been gentle with her. You did not stop doing the ordinary things while the large things sorted themselves out. The ordinary things were what held you together. They were what reminded you who you were when other people were trying to tell you that you were someone else. Wyatt drove them to Dodge City the day before the hearing. They stayed at the same hotel. She did not sleep much, but she lay in the bed with the lamp off and worked through everything she knew in the order she knew it, the way you go through a tool belt before a hard job. Checking what's there, checking that it's solid, making sure nothing important is missing. The courthouse in Dodge City was a 2-story limestone building that smelled of dust and old wood and something that might have been linseed oil. The hearing room on the second floor was smaller than she had expected, with 4 rows of bench seating that were already half full when she and Wyatt arrived, and a table at the front where Calloway was seated with his papers organized in front of him in the particular way she recognized by now, a system that looked like organized chaos and was actually neither. She sat beside Calloway. Wyatt sat behind her. Nathan Graves was already there. She had not seen him in 2 years, and the 2 years had not improved him. He was a large man, larger than Thomas had been, heavier through the shoulders and face, with the well-dressed, well-maintained appearance of someone who spent money on how he looked without it ever quite working the way he intended. He sat at the opposite table with his lawyer, a tall man in a gray suit named Wickfield, who had the practiced, easy confidence of someone accustomed to winning through momentum rather than merit. And Nathan had positioned himself so that he was half facing the room, performing calm for the assembled audience. His eyes found hers when she sat down. She looked back at him the same way she had looked at Garrett Voss through the kitchen window. Directly, without expression, without flinching. She held it until he looked away first, which he did, and she filed that away in the part of her that was still keeping score. The presiding official was a circuit judge named Harmon, a lean man in his 60s with close-cut white hair and an expression of deliberate neutrality that she found reassuring. Judges who performed their authority were harder to trust than judges who had simply internalized it. Wickfield opened first because Nathan was the complainant, and what followed was 20 minutes of the most carefully organized slander Evelyn had ever sat through. She sat with her hands in her lap and her back straight and listened to a version of herself she barely recognized, a calculating woman who had drifted from position to position across Kansas, cultivating trust with vulnerable employers and systematically exploiting it, who had arrived at Raven Creek Ranch with prior knowledge of its financial difficulties and a plan already in motion, who had manipulated a grieving widower. Wyatt, who was not grieving and was not a widower, but Wickfield said it smoothly enough that several people in the benches behind her seemed to accept it, into removing his most trusted employee on the basis of fabricated evidence, clearing the way for a scheme involving land acquisition and financial fraud. The letters were introduced as exhibits. Wickfield read from them with the theatrical control of a man who understood that reading aloud in a certain register could make invented words sound like memory. She kept her hands still in her lap. When Wickfield was done, Calloway stood up. He did not have Wickfield's theatrical quality. He was not trying to. He began with the document's examiner's report, 12 pages long, the product of 3 days of analysis, by a man who had been doing this work for 20 years and who had found, in the letters presented as evidence against Evelyn, 17 specific characteristics of forgery, including ink inconsistency, unnatural pen pressure in letters that should have been fluid, and a left margin alignment pattern inconsistent with natural handwriting, but consistent with someone copying from a sample while trying to reproduce an overall effect. 17, Calloway said again, and let the number sit. Then he put Clara Dobbin's signed statement on the table. He read the relevant section aloud. The precise dates of Evelyn's employment in Abilene, confirmed by Clara Dobbin's own household records, which she had included copies of, spanning a period of 6 months that overlapped exactly with the dates on 2 of the 3 forged letters, both of which were postmarked Wichita. He looked at Judge Harmon. Mrs. Hartwell cannot have posted letters from Wichita in months when she was employed full-time in Abilene and can be confirmed by her employer to have been present in Abilene. The letters are not merely forged, they are temporally impossible. Harmon looked at the papers. He made a note. Wickfield objected on a procedural basis. Harmon overruled it with the economy of a man who has seen the same procedural objection used to slow things down before and has no patience for it. Then Calloway introduced Clem's signed statement. Clement Arthur Rourke, it said at the top, ranch hand of Raven Creek, Ford County, Kansas, in which Clem described in plain language the visit from the man known as Hicks, what Hicks had asked, what Clem had told him, and what Clem knew from his own years of observation about the financial irregularities at the ranch and the identity of the person responsible for them. Clem had written it himself, in large, careful letters, and Calloway read it without editorial comment because it didn't need any. Wickfield said, "The statement of a single ranch hand with no formal education and a personal connection to the accused. Mrs. Hartwell is not the accused," Calloway said quietly. "She is the subject of a complaint. There is a difference, and I'd ask you to observe it." Harmon looked at Wickfield. "Continue, Mr. Calloway." The bank records from Wichita came next. Calloway laid them out methodically. The subpoena had been answered, the records had arrived 2 days earlier, and what they showed was a series of transfers over the past 3 years from an account registered to a business entity called Meridian Land Holdings, which was registered in Ford County, Kansas, with 2 named principals, Garrett Eugene Voss and one Nathan Arthur Graves. The room shifted. She felt it rather than saw it. The specific quality of air in a room when something expected becomes something real. Nathan's lawyer said something quietly to Nathan. Nathan's face had gone the careful, neutral color of someone who has been through legal situations before and has learned not to react visibly. Calloway continued. Meridian Land Holdings had made 3 documented inquiries through a property broker named Harlan Driscoll in Wichita about the acquisition of distressed cattle properties in Ford County. One of those inquiries, made 11 months ago, named Raven Creek Ranch specifically as a target property, with a note that the current owner was overextended and that circumstances were being managed to accelerate a favorable sale. Circumstances were being managed. Harmon read the document himself, holding it with both hands. His expression did not change, but something in his posture did. A very slight straightening, the physical equivalent of a judge coming to attention. Wickfield tried. She gave him credit for trying. He argued that the bank records didn't establish fraud, that a business inquiry was not a crime, that Garrett Voss's financial relationship with Nathan Graves was unrelated to the complaint against Evelyn, that Clem's testimony was motivated by self-interest, that the document's examiner's report was a matter of interpretation. He was a good lawyer, and he made the arguments as well as they could be made, but there is a particular quality to arguments made in defense of something that cannot be defended, and the quality is that they are too smooth. They answer each point with a counterpoint, each concern with a reframing, and the accumulation of smoothness becomes its own kind of tell, because truth doesn't need that much lubrication. Harmon called a recess. Evelyn sat at the table with her hands in her lap and did not say anything. Calloway organized his papers. Wyatt, behind her, leaned forward once and said quietly, "You're doing fine," and she said nothing back because there was nothing to say, and they both knew she wasn't doing anything. She was sitting still while Calloway did what they had paid him to do, which was its own kind of discipline, she thought. Sitting still when you wanted to fight. Trusting the structure. She was not naturally inclined to trust structures. She was inclined to work around them, to solve things through observation and patience and individual effort. Trusting a legal process to arrive at the truth was harder for her than investigating a crime through a kitchen window. But Calloway was good, and the evidence was real, and she had done the work of making it documented and organized and impossible to dismiss, and now the structure had to do what it was built to do. She sat still. Harmon came back. He spoke for about 10 minutes in the organized, sequential way of a man who has spent decades making his thinking follow a clear path, because clear thinking, in his profession, was the difference between justice and its opposite. He reviewed what had been established. He noted the document's examiner's findings. He noted the Dobbins statement and the timeline impossibility. He noted the Meridian Land Holdings connection and the Driscoll inquiry. He noted that the complaint against Evelyn Hartwell rested entirely on documents that had been shown to be forged and a narrative that was directly contradicted by multiple independent sources. He dismissed the complaint. Then he looked at Nathan Graves directly, and said that in light of the evidence of forgery and the established business connection between the complainant and the arrested party in the underlying fraud case at Raven Creek Ranch, he was referring the matter to the Ford County District Attorney for review of potential criminal charges, including conspiracy, fraud, and suborning false evidence. Nathan's face did not change, but his hands, flat on the table in front of him, pressed down slightly, the knuckles going pale. And she saw it because she was watching, and she filed it away the way she always filed things, because the day might come when she needed to remember that Nathan Graves had pressed his hands flat on a table in Dodge City and gone pale when the word criminal was used in a sentence that contained his name. Outside the courthouse afterward, in the limestone-sharp autumn light of a Kansas afternoon, she stood on the steps and breathed. Wyatt was beside her. He didn't say anything immediately, which she had come to depend on as a quality. He let things be what they were for a minute before he started talking about what they meant. "It's not finished," she said. "The district attorney. Nathan will have another lawyer by Monday." "I know," he said. "The Meridian Holdings connection will take time to fully unravel. They'll fight the criminal referral." "Calloway says 6 months, maybe more," Wyatt said. "He'll keep on it." She looked out at the street. A wagon went past with 2 men arguing about something on the seat, their voices carrying and then fading. Dodge City went about its business. The world had not paused for her hearing. "He used Thomas's name," she said, "when he came to town. Thomas Morrison." Wyatt was quiet. I don't think I'll ever understand that," she said. "What kind of person does that?" "The kind who thinks everything is a tool," Wyatt said, "including other people's grief." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the street with an expression that was more complicated than it looked. "He thought it would hurt you if you found out," Wyatt said. "That was the point of it. He wanted to put Thomas's name in the middle of the thing he was building against you, so that even if you won, you'd carry that." She thought about that, about the specific cruelty of it, not the dramatic kind, not anger or violence, but the precise surgical kind, the kind that targets what a person loves and cannot protect. "It worked," she said, "for about 30 seconds. Wyatt made a sound that was somewhere between acknowledgement and something else she didn't have a word for. "That's about 30 seconds longer than it should have." "I'm human," she said. "Yes," he said, "you are." They stood on the courthouse steps for another minute, and then Calloway came out with his coat buttoned and his papers under his arm and said, "Dinner, I think," in the tone of a man who has earned a meal, and that was that. The ride home the next morning was different from both previous rides in a way she couldn't entirely account for. The silence was the same silence, and the road was the same road, and the Kansas landscape was the same flat, enormous gold. But something in the quality of the air between them had shifted, the way air shifts after a storm has passed. Not cleaner exactly, but different, carrying the memory of what it had just moved through. "About an hour from the ranch," Wyatt said. "I want to talk about what comes next." She said, "All right." He kept his eyes on the road. "The offer I started making and didn't finish," he said, "on the last ride." "I remember," she said. "I want you to take over the supply chain and the accounts," he said. "Full authority. You'd work with whoever we bring in as foreman. I've got 2 names I'm considering. But the financial oversight would be yours. The supply contracts, the purchasing, the record keeping." He paused. "The title would be ranch manager, not cook, and the pay would reflect that." She did not answer immediately, which she could see he had expected. He was gripping the reins with the particular steadiness of a man who has said the thing he meant to say and is now waiting to find out what it cost him. "The hands," she said. "Some of them will have trouble with it." "Some of them," he agreed. "Clem won't. Ed won't. Tommy is already following you around like a—" He stopped. "Tommy won't. But some will." "Yes." She looked at the road ahead. "I'd want it understood from the beginning that the authority is real, not nominal. If I find something wrong, I say so, and it gets addressed. I'm not a figurehead with a better title." "That's the only version I'm offering," he said. "And I keep my own records," she said. "Separate from the official ledger. Parallel documentation. After everything, I need that." "That's not unreasonable," he said. She thought about the worn suitcase that was still in her room, still in the same corner where she had left it on her first night. She thought about the $4.30, which was not entirely what it had been anymore, but was still the landmark she returned to in her mind when she needed to know how far she had come. She thought about Thomas, helping her organize the paperwork for the water rights case, the lamp burning low on the kitchen table in Abilene, both of them tired and neither of them saying what they already knew, which was that this was how they were, both of them, and that it was going to make their life harder and neither of them was going to stop. She missed him with a straightforwardness that had stopped surprising her. She was going to miss him for the rest of her life. That was just true, and she had gotten accustomed to carrying it. "All right," she said. Wyatt looked at her then, a quick sideways look. "All right, you'll take it?" "All right, I'll take it," she said. He looked back at the road. She could see the slight shift in his shoulders. Not relief exactly, or not only relief. Something that had more weight to it than relief. As if he had not been entirely certain, and the not being certain had cost him something, and the answer had returned it. They said nothing else about it. There would be time to talk about specifics, about the foreman candidates and the new account structure and how to present it to the hands. There would be time for the district attorney's process and the continuing work of unwinding what Garrett Voss and Nathan Graves had built. There would be time for all of it. The ranch appeared ahead of them in the distance, the cluster of weathered buildings and the enormous barn and the cattle specks far out on the plain, looking exactly as it had looked on the afternoon she had arrived with her suitcase and her list of things she had noticed that didn't add up. She looked at it and felt something she hadn't expected, which was the specific quiet of a place becoming familiar. Not home yet. She did not know if it would become home, but something in the direction of home. The early stage of it, when a place starts to have your shape in it, when you begin to know the sounds it makes at different hours and the light it holds at different times of day, and when that knowing begins to matter to you in a way you didn't plan for. Tommy was on the porch again when they pulled in, but his expression this time was not the tight something's wrong expression of the week before. He came down the steps and took the horses without being asked, the way he had started doing in the past week, and he looked at Evelyn with a question in his face that he was trying not to make obvious. "It's done," she said. "We won." His face broke into something unguarded and young and completely undisciplined, the kind of expression the frontier would cure him of in a few years, and she found herself hoping it wouldn't. "I kept the kitchen right," he said, "like you showed me." "I know you did," she said. She went inside. The kitchen was not quite right. Tommy had organized the spice shelf with a logic that made sense to someone who had never cooked seriously, but it was close, and it was clean, and the stove was drawing well, and the smell of it was the smell of a working kitchen that had been tended. She stood in the middle of it for a moment with her coat still on and let it settle around her. Then she took her coat off, hung it on the hook by the door, and tied on her apron. Over the following weeks, the ranch began the slow, unglamorous work of putting itself back together. Wyatt hired a new foreman, a man named Sorensen, quiet and experienced and without apparent designs on the account books, and introduced Evelyn's new role to the hands in the way she had hoped he would, which was plainly and without ceremony, as if it were simply the next practical thing, which it was. There were two men who visibly struggled with it. One of them, a hand named Pierce, who had been at the ranch 3 years and had very fixed ideas about the proper order of things, gave her trouble for about 2 weeks before a particular afternoon when she caught a $300 error in a cattle purchase contract that would have cost the ranch money it didn't need to lose, pointed it out to Sorensen in front of Pierce, and watched Pierce reassemble his fixed ideas quietly and without further comment. The other man left. She did not lose sleep over it. The district attorney in Ford County filed charges against Nathan Graves in November. The charges included conspiracy to commit fraud, suborning the creation of false evidence, and criminal association with the financial crimes at Raven Creek Ranch. Nathan's lawyers were expensive and effective, and the process was going to take time. Calloway had been right about that. But the charges existed, which meant Nathan's ability to operate in the Kansas territory was effectively suspended while the case moved through the courts. Harlan Driscoll, the property broker, reached a separate agreement with the county that involved him testifying about the Meridian land holdings arrangement in exchange for reduced charges, and what he testified to was comprehensive enough that Calloway sent a wire saying simply, Driscoll sang, "It's enough." Garrett Voss's case was heard in December. He was convicted on 4 counts of financial fraud and 2 counts of theft from an employer, and sentenced to 7 years. He was taken to the state penitentiary without ceremony. The ranch hands received this news with the particular quiet, of people who have decided not to say the things they are thinking, and Evelyn let them have that. Some of them had known Garrett was stealing. Some of them had not. Some of them had suspected and had made the calculation that Clem had made, that the risk of saying something was greater than the cost of staying silent, and were going to have to live with that calculation. She was not interested in being the person who judged them for it. She had made her own calculations in her life that she was not entirely proud of, and she knew what it cost. Clem, she thought, was the interesting one. After his signed statement and his testimony, he had become someone different in the life of the ranch. Not more talkative, not suddenly sociable, but present in a different way, as if having said the true thing at the true moment had freed up some space in him that had been occupied by the weight of not saying it. He started eating his meals at the center of the table instead of the end. He started talking to Tommy, occasionally, in the short, practical way of an older man reluctantly passing something on to a younger one. She thought about that sometimes, about how long people carried things they should have put down earlier, and how much it cost them to carry it, and how much lighter they became when they finally set it down, even when the setting down was hard. She thought about herself. She had carried Thomas's death for 18 months as a kind of anchor against the current, using the grief to stay still, to justify movement that was actually flight, from one position to the next, from one town to the next, from one version of survival to the next. She had told herself it was practicality. She had been, at least partly, wrong. Some of it was fear. The specific fear of a woman who has lost the person who helped her stay in one place long enough to matter, and who is not sure she knows how to stay put without him. She was learning. On a cold morning in January, she was at the kitchen table with the new supply ledger, her system now, organized in the parallel double-entry method she had designed, which Calloway had looked at and called quietly elegant, which she thought was the most professional compliment she had ever received, when Wyatt came in. He poured himself coffee, which he did every morning, and he stood at the counter with it, which he did most mornings, and then he said, "Sorensen wants to expand the East Herd by spring." "I saw his proposal," she said. "The numbers work if the purchase price stays under what he's quoted. I'd want to confirm with 2 additional suppliers before we commit." "That's what I told him," Wyatt said. She looked up from the ledger. He was watching her with the expression she had stopped being surprised by, the one that was not quite assessment and not quite something else, and that she had come to think was just what his face did when he was paying attention to something that mattered to him. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked back at the ledger. "Sorensen's good," she said. "Better than I expected. He catches things." "He said the same about you." Wyatt drank his coffee. "He said he's never worked with anyone who could look at a column of numbers and find the wrong one that fast." "Thomas used to say I had a nose for it," she said. "He meant it as a compliment." "It is one." She wrote something in the ledger. Outside, the January wind was at the walls, the same low, constant sound she had been hearing since September, though it felt different now than it had felt in those first nights when she had lain on the narrow bed and listened to it, with the particular loneliness of a person who does not yet know if they are going to survive what they have gotten themselves into. She had survived it. She was surviving it. Those were different things, the past survival and the present ongoing version of it, and she was still learning the difference. There was something she thought about, not often, but with a regularity that surprised her. The moment she had stood on the step stool in the storeroom with the hidden ledger in her hands. The specific second when she had understood what she was looking at and had felt the 2 paths open in front of her, the one that went away from here and the one that went further in. She had told Wyatt that night at the paddock fence that she had stayed because it was wrong and she could see it, and that was the truth. But it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she had been tired of leaving, tired of the calculation, perpetually, of how much trouble was too much trouble, how much wrong was too much wrong, when to stay and when to go. Tired of making herself small enough to fit into spaces that were not built for her, and then leaving when they became unbearable. She had been tired of that version of her own life, and Raven Creek Ranch, this place she had arrived at with $4.30 and no particular reason for hope, had been the place where she had finally run out of patience with it. She had not stayed because it was the safe thing. She had stayed because she had decided, standing on a step stool in a storeroom in Kansas, that she was done with the version of herself that left when things got hard. It had almost cost her everything. It had given her everything instead. She was not naive about that exchange. She knew that doing the right thing doesn't always end the way it had ended for her. That there were women who had done exactly what she had done and ended up on that stagecoach with nothing, discredited and dismissed, and starting over with less than nothing. She had been lucky, in certain ways, and she acknowledged that without softening it. Lucky that Wyatt had been the kind of man who listened. Lucky that Calloway had been the kind of lawyer who was good at his job. Lucky that Clem had said no to Hicks and then said yes to the truth. Luck was real, and pretending it wasn't was its own kind of dishonesty. But luck was not the whole of it either. The records she had kept, those had not been luck. The patience she had exercised for 3 weeks before saying anything, that had not been luck. The precise, methodical way she had documented everything so that, when the moment came, the truth was not just true but provable, that had not been luck. She had made herself impossible to dismiss. That was the thing she had done, and it was the thing she would do again, and it was the thing she would pass on to Tommy, who was turning out to have a head for organization that surprised everyone but her, and to anyone else who came to this ranch carrying a worn suitcase and not enough money and the knowledge that they had one shot at making something work. You made yourself impossible to dismiss. You kept your records. You stayed when staying was the harder thing. And when someone with more power than you looked at you and decided you were not worth their attention, you went back to the kitchen and you made another pot and you waited for the moment when the truth you had been building caught up with the lie they had been telling. It didn't always work. She knew that. The frontier was full of women who had done everything right and lost anyway, and she carried them in her mind with a specific kind of respect. Not pity, because they had not been pitiful, but acknowledgement, the recognition that the outcome did not determine the quality of the effort, and that some forms of courage were never going to be rewarded in any way anyone could see. But sometimes it worked. The ledger in front of her was proof of that. The kitchen around her was proof. The sound of Tommy humming something tuneless in the yard outside, and Sorensen's voice somewhere near the barn, and the smell of coffee that Wyatt had not yet finished, still standing at the counter behind her. All of it was proof. She wrote the last entry in the morning column, totaled it, and closed the ledger. Sorensen's proposal, she said. I'll have a full assessment by Friday. If the numbers hold, we can move on the East Herd purchase by the end of the month. Good, Wyatt said. She got up to start breakfast. The kitchen was cold in the mornings, always, and the stove took a few minutes to draw up to the heat she needed, and the flour sack was in the wrong place because Tommy had moved it yesterday and hadn't moved it back, and the world was ordinary and imperfect and full of small things that needed doing, the same as it always had been. She built the fire, shifted the flour sack, cracked the first egg against the rim of the bowl. Outside, the Kansas morning was coming up gray and wide, the way it always did, indifferent to what any one person had gone through to earn the right to stand in it. That was the frontier's particular quality. It didn't care what you'd survived. It just kept going and expected you to keep going with it. Evelyn Hartwell had arrived at Raven Creek Ranch with a worn suitcase and $4.30 and a lifetime of being underestimated by people who should have known better. She had stayed. She had kept her records. She had stood firm when the easier and safer thing would have been to walk away. And she had done it not because she was exceptional. She knew she was not exceptional. She was a woman who was good at paying attention and had made that into the most useful tool she possessed. But because there is a specific moment in every person's life when the version of yourself you have been maintaining becomes too small to live in, and the only choice that doesn't cost you something irreplaceable is to finally, at whatever cost, become the size you actually are. She had found that moment on a step stool in a storeroom, with a hidden ledger in her hands and 2 paths in front of her. She had chosen the harder one. She cracked the second egg and the third and got